Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show. The storm brought on by the arcane magic potion swept in many of the powers in Gerosa City. From 11 mage families to 6 underground forces, almost everyone was struggling to raise money. Prime real estate, top-grade magical crystals, rare magic materials, and magic equipment. All these uncommon items seemed to have flooded the market overnight. Prices were dropping day by day as if taking a dive from a high platform. The whole Gerosa City had become crazy. All the powers qualified for the competition were fighting to force their way into the Emerald Tower. As for the Emerald Tower, it was of course the center of the storm. After Jirian had tossed the news out, he'd been staying in the Emerald Tower, feigning illness. Visitation? I'm really sorry, President Jirian is seriously ill. It's a malignant infectious disease. If you're infected, it will lie heavy on our conscience. Why not go back first and come back again a few days later? Sometimes, the circumstance was a scary thing. Just after 2 days, someone as honest as Kevin was poisoned into lying every time he opened his mouth. He spoke of the infection with an anxious expression of pain as if Jirian had not been just ill, but had been infected by a plague instead. Everyone knew what was going on, but there was nothing they could do about the fat old man Jirian. Everyone was at Jirian's mercy now, and what they were waiting for was to rip him off at the auction. So the members of the 10 mage families came and left, and then the members of the 6 underground forces came and left too. The seriously ill Jirian, however, was hiding in the basement, grinning. He counted the arcane magic potions again and again and listened to the noise coming from the hall, the grin on his face growing wider as he did that. He no longer remembered how long it had been since the Gerosa City had been so astir. For the last 20 years, the Guild of Magic had been the top influence in Gerosa City. But those with discerning eyes knew that it was only because the Supreme Council still existed. Without the support of the Supreme Council, the guild would have fallen apart in an instant. Before the emergence of the arcane magic potion, who truly had regard for the Guild of Magic? The same went for old Odin, whom he shared a friendly relation with. If he had not been the president, that old chap who controlled all the assassins in Gerosis would not have given the Guild of Magic any respect. Even that little rascal from the Merlin family had dared to come to his doorsteps to make a demand. PFF. Kicking Felix out of the guild. Hats off to him for thinking about it. I am too brilliant. Thinking back to his decision, Jirian couldn't help but revel in it. It was all because of this decision that the Guild of Magic had become what it was today. 30 bottles of arcane magic potion had made the guild the focus of the entire Gerosa City. If these fellows who were fighting crazily were to know there were another 100+ bottles in the cellar, what expressions would they have on their faces? As the initiator of the potion storm, Jirian knew Lin Li's worth more than anyone else. In his opinion, the arcane magic potion was just the beginning, and it was still far from demonstrating the true worth of Linley. In fact, even Jirian himself wondered what kind of surprises would this almost miraculous potion master bring to the Guild of Magic. Just as everyone was going crazy over the 30 bottles of arcane magic potion, Linley was hiding in the potion lab alone the whole morning. Linley knew about the stir created by the arcane magic potion. If it happened in a different period of time, he would have taken pleasure in receiving the attention. But he had no mood for it now. He found something interesting in the potion lab. It was a few black petals. He had most likely been too tired the past 2 days, and walked into the potion lab again in a daze this morning when he woke up. He wanted to leave once he came to realize where he'd gone, but then he suddenly spotted the flower petals among a pile of potion dregs. The black petals were mixed in the dregs. If not for Linley's good vision, he'd not have been able to differentiate the petals. In the beginning, Linley did not take it to heart. After all, gathering herbs was a troublesome task. Other than a herb master like him, an average person would inevitably pick up some weeds while gathering herbs. Who knew how many weeds he'd picked out from the herbs while he was concocting the arcane magic potion the past few days. Picking up those few petals was an instinctual reaction, just like how one would naturally grasp a woman's breasts when he had his arms stretched out in front of her chest, it was not a hooligan's behavior, but an extremely natural reaction. Anyway, Linley picked up one petal in his hand. It was then that he realized things were wrong. Upon closer inspection, this petal was actually the legendary Black Lotus. Isn't this too phony? Linley could never dream that he'd discover the petals of a Black Lotus among the peacebloom dregs. Although using peacebloom as the main ingredient of the arcane magic potion produced fairly good effects, the growing environment of these herbs was not at all harsh. Simply put, they could grow anywhere. As long as there were mountains and water, there would be peacebloom. The legendary Black Lotus, however, was on another end of the scope. Its growing environment was unbearably harsh, it had to be rich in magical elements, and boast an extreme temperature high enough to melt steel. Most important of all, it had to be watered with molten lava coming from the core of the earth. The molten lava, however, could not be poured directly on the Black Lotus, instead, it could only be run slowly about a meter away from it. All the conditions mentioned above were indispensable. Should there be any slight variance, the Black Lotus would wither away in the shortest of times even if it somehow managed to grow. Aside from such perverted conditions, the emergence of the Black Lotus was universally acknowledged as impossible. Lin Li had put out a high price for news on the Black Lotus in order to achieve a breakthrough in pharmaceutics, but not the slightest simmer of bubbles could be seen even after putting out a reward of hundreds of thousands of gold coins. The reward had been out for a few months. Linley gradually began to give up on the Black Lotus, which only existed in the legends. He had not expected that, a few months later, he'd arrive in another world and discover the trail of the Black Lotus by chance. Could I be this lucky? Linley gazed at the petal in his hand and couldn't suppress his excitement any longer. If news of his luck coming upon a few Black Lotus petals among the peacebloom went out, it would scare some people out of their wits. Linley quickly opened up the ring of endless storm and took out 2 bottles of potion, a blue one and a red one. Sticking to the ratio of 3-to-1, he carefully poured them into a beaker. Once the 2 potions mixed, they immediately gave off an acidic smell, which filled the potion lab. This was a small trick Linley had learnt long ago. Mixing the recovery potion together with the sobriety potion would produce a cocktail potion with the simplest structure and most intense conflicting properties. Through this, the attributes of a certain herb could be perceived directly. Linley gingerly picked up a petal and slowly immersed it in the beaker. When that speck of black came in contact with the potion, a fizzing pop could be heard. The liquid in the beaker churned violently, and white mist arose from it. The acidic smell that had permeated the potion lab seemed to be swept away in an instant, and replacing it was a rush of refreshing fragrance. It is indeed the Black Lotus. Linley placed the beaker in his hands down on the table, as if he was afraid he'd drop all the Black Lotus petals into it. Black Lotus was frequently used in mental strengthening. One of the most powerful end products using it was the legendary ephemeral divinity potion. In that 20 seconds of brief divinity, the user possessed an almost infinite mental strength and was immune to any mortal spells. This thing was definitely the deadliest of weapons. It could block almost anything from humans to gods, and could kill with just a glare. Granted, this thing was just a legend. No traces of the ephemeral divinity potion could be found even in the formulas of pharmacist gurus. Perhaps only someone at the level of a divine smith would have it. In addition, the Black Lotus could also be used to create mental strengthening potions like the infinite magical ability, arcane field, and more. Although they were less freaky than the ephemeral divinity potion, these potions were far more realistic than the illusory divine smith level formula. At least Linley had mastered their formulas when he had reached the level of a pharmacist guru. Besides, these potions were not your average kind. They might not be as freaky as the ephemeral divinity potion, but they were definitely almost there. In particular, the infinite magical ability potion was as enchanting as one wanted it to be. These 3 instantaneous phenomenal spells were enough for a mage apprentice to defeat a legendary mage. Of course, to possess potions with such horrifying powers, the materials needed were not at all ordinary. Other than the legendary Black Lotus, a great deal of rare herbs was also hard to find. After the completion of the potion, sap from the eternity tree had to be added in. Only the sap from the eternity tree would be able to provide magical support to the 3 legendary spells. Anyhow, the Black Lotus could only be met but not asked for. Just these few petals would drive most pharmacists crazy. Moreover, these petals provided a clue for Linley to figure out the place pharmacists dreamed of, the spot where a Black Lotus was growing. The Black Lotus petals were gently kept into the ring of endless storm. Linley was mindful of his hands for the whole time, as if he was afraid he'd bruise the treasure by accident. He was finally done with the work and ready to leave when he met an acquaintance as he walked out of the potion lab. This fellow actually dared to come to the Guild of Magic. Linley was unnerved watching Cromwell enter the Emerald Tower in a distance. Didn't he just threaten Jirian a few days ago about what to do? And the next minute, he came calling on the Guild of Magic, right? The Jirian today was not the Jirian of yesterday. Ever since he had got a hold of the arcane magic potion, it was as if an old man had met an old army doctor. Without a few smokes of the cigarette every day, he'd not be at ease. This fellow had come in so casually, wasn't he afraid that Jirian would take the chance to vent his emotions? The whole Gerosa city was all about the fat old man now that he had the arcane magic potion in his hands. Given the vindictive nature of the old man, he would never let Cromwell come to a good end for offending him. Fellow, I couldn't find you anywhere, so that's where you're hiding. Linley was contemplating whether to hide in a corner and watch the upcoming show when he heard Kevin's voice coming from the hall. Linley looked up, only to see Kevin with a face full of sorrow. What's with the expression? Linley knew best the kind of crap Jirian had arranged for Kevin to do these 2 days. The fellow smirked unkindly upon seeing Kevin's sorrowful face. How was it? I bet you've reaped some profits these few days? Don't even mention. Kevin's pretty face was smothered into a ball of worry. You don't know how I managed to pull through these 2 days. I haven't taken a break since morning. The people coming for Uncle Jirian were unceasing. Everyone was asking how his illness was. I've told the lie about that infectious disease at least 800 times, if not 1,000. I've even come to suspect I'll say the same things in my dreams. Then you'd have to get the time to sleep. Linley dropped another blow on Kevin heartlessly. He stretched out his hand and pointed at the noisy crowd outside the Emerald Tower. Look at the number of people. By the time you play them off, it'll probably be morning. Kevin was so engrossed in the chit-chat with Linley that he was caught unwittingly by Cromwell. After being reprimanded by old Merlin last night, Cromwell was even more anxious to prove himself. Early this morning, he walked into the Emerald Tower, carrying a few level 14 spells. He had even planned out the plea he would give in his mind. In his mind, he had imagined Jirian being overjoyed when he presented him with the spells. Then, he'd start pulling strings, talking about the deep and long-standing friendship the Guild of Magic and Merlin family shared. And when the atmosphere became harmonious, he would represent the Merlin family, and with a tactful and sincere tone, ask to purchase the 30 bottles of arcane magic potion. Perfect. A reserved smile came to Cromwell's face at the thought of that exciting moment. Except, no matter how reserved his smile or how perfect his plan was, there had to be a chance for him to carry it out first. As soon as he walked into the Emerald Tower, Cromwell found that things were quite different from what he had imagined. The mages, who were nothing but polite when they saw him on other days, regarded him as heir today. Even the most enthusiastic ones merely nodded to say hello. Cromwell thought he was mistaken, but it had happened several times. At last, he began to panic. He had already messed up in his handling of the estates. If he couldn't even get this done well, it would be hard to keep his position in the family. So, Cromwell put on his best behavior, something that he rarely did, and tried his best to force a smile on his face, taking the initiative to befriend the mages in the Emerald Tower. Cromwell smiled as his heart bled. He was the son of Matthew Merlin, yet he had to lower his head and be the one taking the initiative to befriend these low-level mages. To the arrogant Cromwell, this was worse than killing him. What Cromwell could not tolerate was the attitude of these damned mages. Those high and mighty faces almost drove Cromwell crazy. He could not accept how these people who had tried so hard to butter up to him could now laugh so contemptuously at him. Cromwell could not remember how he'd managed to pull through that morning. Each time he was forced to show a friendly smile, all he received in exchange were several cold shoulders. Until a moment ago, when he finally saw Kevin. Cromwell, who had dealings with Kevin several times before, knew that if there was an honest person left in the Gerosis Guild of Magic, it would definitely be Kevin. In Cromwell's mind, it was much easier to talk to an honest person. Mage, Kevin, long time no see. Long time no see, Mr. Cromwell. Upon seeing Cromwell, Kevin's head began to ache. If possible, he wished he could say better not see, instead. It was a pity they'd already seen each other. Cromwell, who was like a drowning man clutching at any straw that could save his life, rushed up and shook Kevin's hands, whether the latter wanted it or not. Long time no see, long time no see. Linley, who was standing at a side, was of course ignored. Cromwell had thought that now that Jirian was down with a serious illness, the person who should oversee the Guild of Magic would naturally be his nephew, Kevin. What reasons were there not to cozy up to the guilds in charge and instead engage in a chat with a mage in dire straits? Besides, as the heir to the Merlin family, Cromwell could not afford to lower himself and initiate a greeting with a low-level mage. Linley was good at taking hints. As Cromwell's expression fell into his eyes, he knew exactly what was going on in his mind. But it was better to accept being ignored lest he should be approached with a smiling face and too embarrassed to make trouble for him in the future. Cromwell had thought of his plea before he came, but because he had to hold it back for the whole morning, he had almost gotten sick from keeping it in for too long. Now that he finally caught up with Kevin, he'd never give him a chance to resist. He had not let up ever since he had a grab of Kevin's hands. He began with the friendship they had shared since childhood, and then went on to talk about the deep and long-standing friendship between the Merlin family and the Guild of Magic. The bombardment of words and favor had made Kevin extremely drowsy and miserable. Brother Kevin, to be honest, I really admire you. Father once told me that you are the only young man in the whole Gerosis city with a stronger gift in magic than me. I had not believed him then, only last year, when you had surpassed level 8 in the mage certification, did I realize Father's vision was not wrong. Upon hearing this, an honest person such as Kevin himself could hardly refrain from cursing. You son of a watermelon, one should avoid the face of the person he was beating up. Didn't he know about that? Kevin glanced guiltily at Linley and thought, surpassing level 8 surprises you? If you knew someone who had just been exposed to magic for 3 months surpassing level 8, wouldn't you be scared crazy right on the spot? Not to mention your father would probably be driven crazy too if he saw the crystal ball glowing for 28 minutes. Lauding me as a magic genius in front of this someone, isn't he trying to push me into a pit of fire? Kevin finally saw a silver lining when the sun was about to set. He had waited long for Cromwell to ask about Jirian. I'm so sorry, the president has been overly exhausted recently, and so he has not been feeling very well. He's resting in the Emerald Tower at the moment. Kevin was awfully agitated when he delivered the sentence. It was as if the race that had been enslaved for thousands of years suddenly saw the dawn of victory at the end of the Dark Ages. That's too bad, Cromwell's expression was aggrieved. Then, can I see him? My father had told me to bring him a small gift when I left home this morning. At last, Kevin had waited for this sentence after being tortured for the whole afternoon. Visitation? Well, I'm really sorry. President Jirian is seriously ill this time, and it's a malignant infectious disease. If you're infected, it will lie heavy on our conscience. Why don't you go back first and come back again a few days later? Kevin had repeated this for at least 1,000 times in the past 2 days, but never had he felt this joyful saying it. The words came as he opened his mouth, and he spoke without feeling burdened, much less worried that he'd sleep talk in the night. He even felt a stone lifted off his heart after he'd finished the sentence. The smile froze on Cromwell's face. This was not the result he had expected after all the meticulously prepared pleas, smiles, and flattery. For a moment, Cromwell stood at a loss, staring blankly at Kevin. He could not comprehend how things had become like this. Even Linley was shaking his head as he listened from the side. Circumstance was a scary factor, even an honest person like Kevin was poisoned into lying as he opened his mouth. The smile that was meant to be a sign of resignation was deemed an ineffable sarcasm in Cromwell's eyes. Kevin's refusal had his breath stuck in his chest, and he suddenly found an outlet to vent it out. "What are you laughing at?" Cromwell's fair face was badly contorted, and a pair of gleaming red eyes were fixed on Linley in a glare. That bearing and expression looked as though he was about to devour Linley alive. "Mr. Cromwell, Kevin was just feeling elated earlier on, and never imagined this was how things would progress in the blink of an eye." When realization finally hit him and he was about to step in, things were already too late. Cromwell's eyes were fiendish, his expression contorted. His agitated outburst rained spittle on Linley's face. "This is the end." Kevin knew things were bad as he recalled the two unlucky men outside Jerosa's exchange. He had figured out Linley's character after being together for a long time. His character was almost like Jirian's. As long as he wasn't provoked, everything could be talked about nicely. But once the fellow was provoked, he would not show any mercy to anyone he laid hands on. He would not move unnecessarily, but once he did move, he would definitely move in the direction of death. Although the Guild of Magic had some frictions with the Merlin family, they were after all the top influence in Jerosa City. If anything happened to Cromwell here, it would not be up to Kevin to imagine the chaos that would happen in Jerosa City. "Do you have any matters at all?" "The things I've discussed with Mage, Kevin, were top secrets that belonged to the Merlin family and the Guild of Magic." "What's your status now? Have you forgotten your name after worming your way into the Guild of Magic, having the guts to eavesdrop on our top secrets? Won't you scram yet?" What made Kevin troubled was Cromwell not knowing what he was doing as he continued his reckless clamor. Kevin wanted to die after hearing the malicious bawl coming from Cromwell. He wanted to slap that fool across the face and ask him whether he knew whom he was swearing at. That person was the most privileged one in the Guild of Magic, and even Jirian had to welcome him with a smiling face. But now, he was being pointed at and asked to get out. Kevin felt himself turning crazy. It's the end, it's the end. Kevin's heart was thumping as he watched Linley, who was still smiling. Amidst Cromwell's outcry, the guild hall seemed to have fallen into silence in an instant. Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned their attention to Cromwell. Their expressions were full of sympathy and compassion at first. Then, they turned to one of watching an idiot with a congenital disability. Jirian said nothing for the past few days, but in their hearts, they had already associated Linley with the 30 bottles of arcane magic potion. It was just too obvious. Jirian had just granted him the best privileges in the Guild of Magic, and in the twinkling of an eye news of 30 bottles of arcane magic potion came out. Even the blind could see the link between them. If there was anyone in the Guild of Magic that could never be messed with now, it would undoubtedly be the young mage wearing a worn mage robe standing in front of him. Even Cromwell's father, old Merlin, who was said to be on par with Jirian in terms of magic attainments, would have no other way out except to die if he messed with the young mage, let alone someone like Cromwell. Someone who could bring out 30 bottles of arcane magic potion at once would not mind having another 30 bottles out. Under this fatal temptation, who knew how many assassins would be out there, waiting for Cromwell? Yet he was still clamoring endlessly, not knowing how the word death was spelled. Among all those present, perhaps it was only Cromwell who did not understand. Ever since returning from the Sunset Mountains, Cromwell had not felt this joyful before. The resentment that had been amassed for a long time exploded today, and the fury he had held in his chest finally found an outlet to vent it. Every word was vicious to the core and full of sarcasm, from the worn mage robe Lin Li was wearing to his inability to afford even a magic staff, his unawareness of his own status yet participating in such an important conversation. Satisfying. Cromwell had never felt this satisfied in a long time. But satisfaction was intriguing. It was like that very thing, coming when the satisfaction was to the fullest. Cromwell was as such. He was satisfied, but just as his satisfaction reached the fullest, he saw Linley lifting his right hand. There were no other gestures, and no complex spells. There was only an intense magical wave and a muffled thud. Immediately, Cromwell felt as if he had been hit in the face with a hammer. In that moment, Cromwell even felt like his whole face was shattered. It was an incomparable force, bursting on his face all at once. The force was extremely powerful. Cromwell hardly had the time to let out a cry before being knocked off. He flew a whole dozen meters like a kite with broken strings. At last, he landed heavily on the steps of the door, with all eyes on him. Cromwell felt nothing except coldness and dampness. His head was heavy and spinning, as if someone had just clamped the door on him. His nose seemed to be broken as well, a gush of warmth flowing out from his nostrils. It mingled with the water stains on his face, with him not knowing if it was blood or water. He clearly saw what struck him was a waterspout. It would indeed come for those who were satisfied to the fullest. But Cromwell was unlucky. It came for him, but it came on his face. The hall hushed all of a sudden. The dozens of mages present, including Kevin, had been studying magic for at least 20 years. They could easily see that the magic Linley used was a level 2 waterfall strike. A level 2 waterfall strike wasn't intimidating at all. What was intimidating was the way Linley had used it. There was no redundant gesture, nor sound of chanting at all. It was merely a lift of the hand, and the waterfall strike was unleashed. This was a genuine, instantaneous burst of power. Even a mage apprentice knew that it was not the mental strength or the mana that limited a mage's ability to fight, it was the time taken to prepare. Complex hand gestures and lengthy spells kept the mage in a battle walking a tightrope. Most of the mages in the world were studying the same question: how to unleash magic in the quickest way. As for the interpretation of quick, it would no doubt be the instantaneous outburst. But it was just too difficult. Absolute control of the mental strength, accurate allocation of the mana, and the complete breakdown of the elemental structures. It had gone beyond the scope of knowledge and technology, and belonged entirely to another level. Perhaps some mages above the level 10 could unleash 2 level 1 and 1 level 2 spell in an instant with their decades of accumulated experience, but for many mages, instantaneous outburst was nothing but a distant dream. But everyone had witnessed how a level 2 spell was unleashed instantly today. Furthermore, the one who had used this level 2 spell was a young mage, not over the age of 20. All these had exceeded their imagination. Demon, a gray-bearded mage in the crowd looked on with a glazed expression. His words were a complete representation of the crowd's thoughts. Other than a demon, no one could come up with another word to describe the young mage. For a moment, the hall was alarmingly quiet. Except for the sounds of rapid breathing, only Linley's light footsteps could be heard coming from the steps. Linley kept the smile on his face. He even greeted Cromwell politely as he approached. "Long time no see, Mage Cromwell." Long time no see," Cromwell backed down subconsciously. Due to his wounded nose, there was a faint twang in the broken voice. Linley had killed a wyvern right before his eyes back when they were in the Sunset Mountains, but Cromwell had always thought that this low-life mage was never his rival. It was only luck that he'd managed to kill the wyvern with that shot of icicle piercing right into the wyvern's wound. If not for that, he'd long be torn to pieces by the wyvern. Cromwell had always believed that Kevin was the only young man in the Guild of Magic worthy enough to be mentioned in the same breath as him. He had believed that the mage, 3 years older than him and 3 years ahead of him to be certified level 8, was his only rival in Gerosis City. As for Linley, he was nothing but a low-level mage. But now, he crumbled with a bang before such a low-level mage. There were no explanations and no reasons. It was merely a simple yet brutal waterfall strike, and it thoroughly shattered the pride Cromwell held for over 20 years. While on the floor, Cromwell suddenly realized just how frail he was. Linley bent over Cromwell, the smile never leaving his face. Only his eyes revealed a menacing light, such that Cromwell never doubted he'd kill him with a lift of his hand. Endless fear welled up from the bottom of his heart, as if he was back in the Sunset Mountains in an instant, faced with the terrifying Thunder Gorilla. He shrank back involuntarily once more. Enough. Just then, a voice came from below the steps. Upon hearing the familiar voice, Cromwell, who was just sinking into fear, was like a drowning man clutching at a life-saving straw. "Father! Shut up! Don't you find yourself embarrassing enough?" Old Merlin emerged from the crowd. He wore a black mage robe, his right hand clutching a green staff. He exuded an aura so powerful that even on the steps a distance away, Linley could sense an irresistible pressure. "Mage Velik, thanks for disciplining my child on my behalf." Old Merlin looked sincere and bowed slightly at Linley. But when he looked up, his eyes divulged a hint of murderous intent. "But some things should be left to me, the father. Young man, it never hurts to be a little kinder." As old Merlin's voice settled, the magical elements in the surroundings turned into a violent wave, like a giant vortex spreading across the area. Linley felt an unprecedented pressure standing in the center of this vortex. He had to clench his teeth tightly to ensure he wouldn't bend under this immense pressure. At the same time, old Merlin's mental strength was surging like torrential tide, dealing an impact with every wave to the center of the vortex where Linley stood. "You're too polite." Linley clenched his jaws, sparking an abnormal mental strength all of a sudden, barely enduring the battle with old Merlin where he faced too huge a gap in the first place. But between a level 15 Archmage and a level 8 mage, mental strength alone would be far from enough to compensate for the huge disparity in power. It was an all-dimensional disparity, not only in power and experience, but also in the comprehension of rules. At this moment, old Merlin seemed like a veteran who had mastered the rules of the game, bullying a newcomer who had just entered the gaming circle. Once you surpassed level 15 to reach the realm of an Archmage, your understanding of the entire world of magic would be on completely another level. No matter how strong Linley's mental strength was, or how near infinite his mana was, he could never overcome such disparity in level. What he could do now was to hang on and persevere. But even so, he could not hold on for too long. For Linley could clearly feel the giant vortex spinning at a crazier speed. After waves and waves of mental strikes, he was on the brink of collapse. It was a feeling of desperation. In the midst of the huge vortex, Linley felt that he had no room to fight back. An Archmage is indeed impressive. It was the first time Linley had met an adversary impossible to overcome ever since he had transmigrated. A profound sense of frustration sprung from his heart. In fact, at this time old Merlin was feeling no more peaceful than Linley. The young mage before him was no more than 20 years of age, much younger than Cromwell. But in the control of power, he was several times stronger than Cromwell, who had displayed an outstanding talent from a young age. Old Merlin had also observed in the probe earlier on how horribly strong this young man's mental strength was. He had given it his all, yet he couldn't figure out where his limit actually was. Old Merlin knew very well it was all because of his deeper understanding of the rules that he was able to dominate the battle. There was a difference of 10 levels between both sides, and in the end this would be the way to decide the winner in this battle. Mage was a highly hierarchical profession, and each level implied a great progress in power. The gap between an Archmage and a mage was vaster than the Sea of Darkness. It was only in leveled battles, such as those between old Merlin and Jirian, that competition was the rule. An Archmage oppressing a mage was an absolute crush. But the crush that was expected eventually came to such a situation at present. Even old Merlin could not help but be startled. The only thing that pleased old Merlin was that this unequal yet ridiculous battle was at last coming to an end. Thinking it over, old Merlin felt pathetic. He was an Archmage, yet he was taking pride in defeating a mage. The giant vortex spun insanely, and the waves of mental strikes were each one wave higher than another. Just as Linley thought he would be swallowed by the giant vortex, a familiar voice rang from within the Emerald Tower. "Matthew, I see you're really getting out of it." The next moment, Linley felt the weight lifted off his body. The giant vortex seemed to vanish without a trace in an instant, as if it had never been there before. Old Merlin still stood at the bottom of the steps a distance away. His eyes shifted from Linley to the depths of the Emerald Tower. Jirian came out of the tower, looking as clumsy as ever. His round figure was moving rather than walking. "Cut the crap, Jirian. You've got to give me an explanation for what happened today." "Give you AF*CK. Jirian retorted with a glare. I say, Matthew, you're old enough now, shouldn't you be more sensible? Demanding an explanation when you bullied someone from my guild, do you really think I'm easy to bully now that I've gained weight in these 2 years? As Jirian's voice fell, the atmosphere outside Emerald Tower turned intense. All hearts were lifted to their owners' mouths. This was not a battle between Linley and old Merlin like the one before, that was merely payback from a father for beating up his son. Now, both men standing there were Archmages over level 15, and were likewise 2 of the top powers leading Gerosis. Once the 2 powers turned against each other, the whole of Gerosis would fall into turmoil. If you're enjoying my content, please consider donating a coffee. Or checking out my shirts on TeePublic. You sure? Old Merlin placed a foot on the step. Cromwell lay not far from where he stood, but old Merlin did not even look at him. He pointed his green staff at Jirian, the huge magical crystal that was embedded at the tip of the staff emitting a misty green flame. The violent magic wave seemed to bring along a gust of strong wind outside the Emerald Tower. Dust and scraps of paper on the ground were picked up and swirled like little dancers in the sky. A compelling aura was felt from old Merlin. It was different from the confrontation with Linley earlier on. This time, the aura was even more violent and powerful. Only then did Linley know how lucky he was as he felt the power contained in the aura. If old Merlin had not suppressed him with his mental strength and attacked directly instead, Linley would probably have ended up lying flat on the steps long before Jirian came to his rescue. It was totally 2 different worlds for a level 8 mage and a level 15 archmage. Old Merlin was wrong for choosing a field Linley was best at. That was an abnormal mental strength that even a legendary mage would be jealous of. But even in this field, old Merlin, with his understanding of the rules, had won without a doubt. Linley stood watching old Merlin from afar. He could only see one word from him: difference. As old Merlin walked up the steps, Jirian tightened his grip on the staff. A powerful aura, as powerful as that of old Merlin, radiated from Jirian. His body, originally overstuffed, was as imposing as a mountain in that instant. It would only take a moment for 2 of the most powerful mages in Gerosis to collide with a dazzling spark. You had long wanted to teach me a lesson after putting up with me for so many years, right? Jirian's manner was as calm as before even in the midst of immense pressure. Cut the crap, Jirian. Old Merlin's expression was firm, but in his heart, he let out a sigh. If Cromwell hadn't failed him, he wouldn't have challenged Jirian, who was an archmage just like him, with no assurance of winning. Those 30 bottles of arcane magic potion were important, but what old Merlin was more interested in was the Guild of Magic that had its own pharmacist. After all, a starving camel was still bigger than a horse. The Guild of Magic, which had been down and out for decades, could still stand against the Merlin family in Gerosis City. How would it look if they were to have a pharmacist of their own? For an archmage like old Merlin, he had sent Cromwell to convey their good intentions, and had even presented 4 level 14 spells that had been in their family hoard. Apart from the 30 bottles of arcane magic potion, what he had wanted to do more was to repair the relationship with the Guild of Magic. How could old Merlin not see with that wisdom of his that the Guild of Magic with its own pharmacist would eventually unify the whole Gerosis City? Of the many forces in Gerosis City, the Guild of Magic would definitely be dominating all in the future. Since the rise of the Guild of Magic was something that couldn't be stopped, old Merlin thought it wise to extend a friendly hand to them before it happened. Besides, old Merlin had been doing it well for the past 20 years. He had not had any conflict with the Guild of Magic, and had even materialized some business dealings with them. Old Merlin believed that as long as he was sincere, Jirian, judging by his character, would have made the same wise choice as he did. Therefore, he had sent Cromwell with 4 level 14 spells. But this rascal had ruined everything. Just 2 days ago, he had even sworn to him that the young mage named Felic was merely at a level 5 or 6, and had just joined the Guild of Magic for no more than 10 days. At the thought of this, old Merlin was so angry he felt his lungs were about to explode. Just look at how he had performed, unleashing a level 2 waterfall strike in an instant. How was that the strength of a level 5 or 6 mage? This was probably the general standard of most magic shooters. And look at Kevin's expression standing before him. He was Jirian's nephew, and undoubtedly the second in command in the Guild of Magic. Yet he had to do things as he pleased. How could he be an insignificant character? But it was too late for anything. In fact, even old Merlin had not imagined this young mage Felix would be so ruthless. There were no greetings or negotiation, only a direct waterfall strike with the lift of his hand. The waterfall strike had shattered not just the pride Cromwell had held for over 20 years, it had also shattered the plans that old Merlin had before. The instant Cromwell was swept out of the Emerald Tower, old Merlin knew everything was over. The Merlin family had lost all in the competition for the arcane magic potion, and it had also completely blocked the path to restoring its friendship with the Guild of Magic. No one would choose an ally who harbored resentment, even if it was only the ally's son who harbored the said resentment. Unless old Merlin was willing to disown Cromwell and choose another successor. But everyone knew it was impossible. Old Merlin had only one son, and Cromwell was his only choice. Old Merlin had only one choice at the moment, to defeat Jirian. Jirian and he had always been two of the most powerful mages in Gerosa City. It was only by defeating him that he could establish himself as the #1 mage in Gerosis, and allow the Merlin family to tide through the future crises peacefully. Before the absolute power of the #1 mage, the mage families that had been waiting for their chance would most likely remain well-behaved for a period of time. At the same time, Jirian's defeat would also silence the Guild of Magic for a long while. They would have to gather their strength again and wait for the next opportunity to rise. The time might not be long, but it would be sufficient for the Merlin family in their preparations. For old Merlin, this would be the best outcome for this whole event. But, if possible, he wished he would not have to go that far. After becoming an Archmage, there were many things that often did not have to be seen with the eyes. Just by feeling, old Merlin was sure that Jirian's power would not be any weaker than his own. The winner of the battle between the Archmages would probably have to be decided by luck. Old Merlin would never do anything uncertain in his life. He had never given everything to luck, like what he was doing now. The green flame rising up from the magical crystals raged on, and at the same time, the surrounding magical wave had reached its peak. With a short and rapid recitation of the spell, a red flame lit up on old Merlin's hands. With a stamp of the staff in his hand, everyone present seemed to feel space distorting in the surroundings. Stalks of red lotus with long flaming tails in tow emerged as if from hell and bombarded the Emerald Tower amidst their howl. Just as the stalks of red lotus were about to erupt, Jirian held up the staff in his hand, which was followed by a likewise short and rapid recitation of the spell. Almost immediately, a water-blue barrier was erected outside the gates of Emerald Tower. The stalks of red lotus fell into the water curtain like stones falling into water as ripples appeared on the barrier's surface. "Damn you, old Merlin!" An angry roar came out of the tower, accompanied by Jirian's furious interrogation. "What does you mother do? You son of a b*tch, are you trying to tear down the Emerald Tower?" Old Merlin paid no heed to his fury, his lips continued their rapid recitation of the spells. The green flame burned fiercely from the magical crystal at the tip of his staff, and another layer of fire rain came falling down, hitting the blue water curtain with a sizzle. "You've got guts." Jirian let out a furious bellow, and the blue water curtain was instantly stretched to its limit. He made a strange gesture with his fat hands, and magical elements came pouring out from the ground all at once. And the source of magical elements was right beneath the steps where Cromwell lay. Old Merlin's expression changed, and he aimed his staff right onto Cromwell's shoulders. Before the latter could understand what was happening, the magical crystal at the top of the staff exhibited a peculiar distortion as if it had changed into a pair of giant hands in just an instant, clutching Cromwell in it. Cromwell felt weight leaving his body, and then he was pulled to the back of where old Merlin stood. Almost concurrently, two razor-sharp rock spines broke the earth and thrust themselves out of the ground. Cromwell looked back and felt nothing but a tingling scalp. If he were to let those two rock spines stab through his body, even if there were 10 Cromwells there, they'd be done for altogether. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Jirian took a big stride and lunged out of the tower. With the support of the levitation spell, his plump body was floating in the air as soon as he came out. There was no hesitation at all. Large verses of spells came streaming out from his mouth, his fat hands constantly making abstruse and incomprehensible gestures. Old Merlin pushed Cromwell aside and met Jirian without fear. The magical elements outside the Emerald Tower swarmed madly. Each time the grandiose magic collided, it'd spark off resplendent rays of brilliance. As Old Merlin levitated into the air, both exchanged almost 10 strikes. Each attack was no less an extremely powerful top-level magic. Linley stood at the bottom of the tower a distance away. He'd realized his previous battling styles were in no sense perfect after watching the battle of the two archmages. Instantaneous outbursts of numerous low-level magic could indeed take an unexpected effect. But in the face of absolute power, a low-level magic would be rendered a joke. Not to mention how he'd go about blocking Old Merlin's fire rain. If he were to throw wind blades at the blue water curtain Jirian had drawn up, it would probably take years for him to break it. This was a typical battle of the mages, so their battling styles were no doubt the most traditional. There was no control at all, and no counter-control as well. What they were battling with was absolute power. The one that had stronger magical power and a more abundant level of mana would eventually emerge as the winner. Of course, it was not to say that instantaneous outbursts of magic were inferior. But, sometimes, instantaneous outbursts were not everything. The two archmages possessed the ability to unleash low-level magic instantaneously, and were even adept at that as compared to Linley. But they had never showed any instantaneous outburst of magic since the start of the battle, for they knew clearly that the instant magic outbursts they could unleash would never pose a threat to the other. As for long recitation of spells, it would only be a death-seeking move in a battle of this level. Even if it was only a second slower, it'd be enough to send people to eternal doom. Both had chosen the middle course almost undesignedly. Short and rapid recitation of spells together with swift gestures had created a magnificent and ever-changing battle. After figuring out the crux of the matter, Linley was even more absorbed in the battle, not batting his eyelids once. Every gesture and recitation were etched in his mind. With every fierce collision, Linley gradually figured out answers to questions he had before, and at the same time, questions he had never thought of before arose in his mind. If there was anyone who benefited the most from the battle, it would undoubtedly be Linley. The teachings and influence of a legendary mage had laid the most solid foundation for him. His extraordinary talent had also given him higher comprehension than ordinary people. A battle like this would be a grand and exciting one in the eyes of others, but never as enlightening as it was to Linley. When the battle reached its climax, Linley even forgot his own existence. He had totally immersed himself in the magical collision. His heart and soul all fluctuated with the battle, and his nerves trembled with the magical elements. It was an almost abstruse state, and Linley, being immersed in that state, was as if in another world by himself. In this world, he was approaching the nature of magic with unbelievable speed. Boom! Both sides collided again. The aftershock brought on by the collision of two enormous lumps of mana radiated off and pushed Linley a few steps back. Sparks of scorching meteors fell from the sky, leaving behind glamorous trails. The earth-shaking strike had finally brought the magnificent battle to a close. Among the blazing light, two silhouettes descended slowly, a sign of mana exhaustion. Damn. Linley had never imagined a classic and perfect battle like this would end up with both parties exhausting their mana. Countless powerful spells had at last exhausted all mana of both parties. They had exhausted their mana almost at the same time. The slow descent was merely a buffer with the levitation spell. Jirian held on to his bucket-thick waist as he gasped for air. The fat on his body rose and fell with dramatic gasps, and cold sweat broke out on his pale, chubby face. Although he was still staring at old Merlin fiercely, everyone present knew that he was a spent arrow now. Old Merlin was no better. He had to rely on Cromwell's support in order to stand firm on his feet when he landed. But, for some reason, old Merlin's pale face carried a hint of a smile. Jirian had given up. Things were obvious, both were archmages, and both had exhausted their powers. No one could do anything to each other now, so how could he still smile with such confidence? In fact, Jirian felt a tinge of joy as soon as the mana was exhausted on both sides. Neither had the strength of an archmage now, and he had dozens of people standing behind him. It would be a challenge the moment when they'd rush forward and surround the Merlins. Not to mention, he had a physical advantage. Just think, a 200 or 300-pound man pouncing could easily crush him flat. Hence, Jirian could not figure out just why old Merlin was all smiles and victory when he had such a huge advantage over him. The old fellow glared at old Merlin. "You can still laugh after being beaten by me? Are you a damn ostrich?" Old Merlin was barely able to steady himself with the help of Cromwell and still looked weak. He had heard Jirian's yell, but chose to ignore it, clinging onto his chest as he broke out in a violent cough. Old Merlin looked like an old man with one foot in the grave, worn and weak, without the bearing of a great archmage. However, regardless of how weak he was, old Merlin's had a confident smile on his face all this while. It made Jirian all the more unhappy to see it. He dragged his weak body and set forth towards old Merlin. He would not let the mages in the guild lift a finger. He was going to crush that bastard old Merlin all by himself. But as old Merlin's smile gradually expanded and his emaciated right hand reached into the pockets, Jirian's expression stiffened all of a sudden. He saw old Merlin pulling something out of his pockets. It was a sky-blue crystal. In the afterglow of the setting sun, the sparkling crystal reflected a colorful halo. That halo was gorgeous yet blurry, like the most beautiful of dreams. A pure magical aura was emitted from the crystal. There were no traces of impurity in the aura at all. It was authentic and clean, gentle and soft, like a flowing river from the countryside, moistening the earth without a sound. The confident smile of old Merlin was even more unfathomable under the gleam of the crystal halo. "If you had a strong energy crystal, you'd probably be smiling like me now." Though he was answering Jirian's questions, his eyes were fixed on the crystal on his hand. He was somewhat enchanted by the colorful halo, and also somewhat unwilling to shift his eyes away from it. The whole Emerald Tower became silent as old Merlin's voice spread throughout it. Everyone's attention fell upon the halo, all kinds of emotions intertwined, confusion, shock, greed, and uncertainty, creating a strange atmosphere within the Emerald Tower. The people present were mages of at least level 5 and above. Other than a dabbler like Lin Li, who had never heard the great name of the strong energy crystal, it was something that almost every mage yearned for. Its powerful calming effect prevented the bite of mana when unleashing spells. To a mage, the bite of mana was much more fearful than the opponent. In addition, the strong energy crystal could amplify the effects of meditation. As long as one had the crystal by their side, the meditation's effects could be raised to a terrifying level. But the real power of the strong energy crystal was that it could completely restore mana. For a mage, nothing was much more valuable than mana. Full restoration of mana could change almost everything at the critical moment. For example, the battle between two archmages right before their eyes, being the most powerful mages of Gerosa's city, and having exhausted the last of their mana, with old Merlin's condition worse than Jirian's as he could not even steady himself, it seemed to be over. But right at this crucial point, old Merlin had taken out the strong energy crystal. Jirian's expression changed when the sky-blue crystal was taken out. His pale chubby face turned to a terrible color of bluish-white. It was nearly an expression of despair. It did not matter who, there would only be profound anguish for anyone in this situation. Both had exhausted all their mana, but the enemy possessed the opportunity to restore all his mana at the most critical time. There was probably nothing else in this world that could feel more helpless than this. Jirian stood glued to the ground. The gaze he had on old Merlin was a lifeless one. He had never felt so powerless before. What had obviously been an evenly matched enemy became one that could throttle him to death in an instant as effortlessly as crushing an ant. After the initial stupor, the mages in the Emerald Tower seemed to have realized all of a sudden what the strong energy crystal meant. It meant that old Merlin could kill Jirian any time now, sending the Guild of Magic into depths of despair once and for all. But as soon as realization hit them, almost all the mages had an expression of vivid fear on their faces. Everyone knew that the Guild of Magic actually belonged to Jirian alone. It was all because of Jirian that the guild was able to survive such a difficult time for 20 years and was able to stand against the #1 mage family, the Merlins. Once Jirian collapsed, it would be the end of the Guild of Magic. Perhaps it was only a dabbler like Lin Li who had not understood the situation. He stared puzzled at old Merlin, thinking about how despicable that old fellow's smile was. Could it be that he had a secret weapon with him? As it was a good habit to ask when one didn't know, he nudged Kevin with his elbow and asked humbly, "What is that thing that the old fellow has in his hands?" "Strong energy crystal." Kevin was distracted. He was worried about the circumstances Jirian was in. But after the repeated questioning from Linley, he explained the origin of the strong energy crystal in a simple way. Other than the effects of calming the mind and strengthening meditation, it also has the power to restore mana. Although such power can only be used once, under this situation, I'm afraid Uncle Jirian. Restore mana? Linley was astounded. That old fellow Jirian looked to be a smart person and knew how to exploit his own surplus value usually. How could he see a broken crystal this day and be scared silly by it? Was it possible that the battle with old Merlin had damaged his brain? Restore mana. Linley touched his nose. He felt like asking Jirian, "How many times do you wish to recover?" Old Merlin squeezed the crystal ball in his right hand and all at once traces of light escaped from the gaps between his fingers. The pure and clean aura gushed into old Merlin's body at an unimaginable speed. With that surge of power, color had returned to the pale and frail face. Everyone could clearly feel that old Merlin was recovering his mana at lightning speed. The depletion brought about by the earlier battle was quickly recovered to the full by the strong energy crystal. In just a few seconds, the seemingly frail old man would become the most powerful mage in Gerosis. Outside the Emerald Tower, the sky was covered with layers of thick, dark clouds. A bitter smile came across Jirian's face. The winner of the battle between the most powerful mages of Gerosis was actually decided by a crystal. Everyone was in despair, including Kevin. All was for naught in the face of a mage with a fully restored mana. Though they had plenty of people in the Emerald Tower, none could help Jirian. Old Merlin's smile spread across his face. It seemed like the situation was too far gone beyond repair. Just when everyone thought that the defeat of the Emerald Tower was a foregone conclusion, Linley shook his head helplessly. Looks like his brain was really damaged. The voice wasn't loud, but enough for everyone around to hear. Immediately, about 4 or 5 mages turned around. The stares they gave Linley were filled with rage, even Kevin's. He was the one most familiar with Linley out of all others. And it was due to this that he knew how much Jirian valued Linley, and how much pressure Jirian had endured when those privileges were given to Linley. Never had he expected Linley to say such a thing when Jirian was at the most dangerous of times. Kevin's face turned unusually surly as he looked at Linley with rage and contempt in his eyes. "Mage Felix, you really disappoint me. Why are you all looking at me like that? Also, Kevin, if you're to be disappointed, you should be disappointed in that old fellow." Linley shook his head resignedly and slowly pulled out a sky-blue bottle from his pockets. If his brain wasn't damaged, he would have asked for help long ago. Does he really think that he could take the whole Gerosa city being an Archmage? Under the deepening eventide, the sky-blue bottle flared an even dazzling glow than the strong energy crystal. It was likewise gorgeous yet blurry, emitting the same pure magical aura. When the beam of halo penetrated from Linley's hands, the few people who were glaring at Linley were dumbfounded almost at the same time. Kevin blushed, then showed a look of surprise on his face. As for the mages behind him, all of them let out cheers. The cheering alarmed everyone, including old Merlin and Cromwell. All kinds of looks were shot in their direction, looks of doubt, surprise, and suspicion, and then they saw Linley emerge from the crowd. "Looks like you're really getting on age, even your brain stopped working," Linley whispered quietly. Under Jirian's astounded stare, he stuffed the sky-blue glass bottle into his hand. Jirian was slightly confounded, but very soon sensed mana tumbling in the glass bottle. It was pure and clean, just like the strong energy crystal in old Merlin's hands. This is similar to the strong energy crystal. I remember it was called the awakening potion or something, Linley added softly, but I prefer to call it the Red Bull drink. Who had the time to study the Red Bull drink with him at this critical time? Before Linley's voice faded, Jirian had already removed the bottle cap and poured the awakening potion into his mouth. He took in the pure mana contained in it while savoring the sweet yet sour aftertaste in his mouth. As soon as he gulped down the awakening potion, Jirian knew what the outcome would be. The speed of mana recovery brought on by the awakening potion far exceeded that of the strong energy crystal old Merlin held in his hands. Almost instantly, the exhausted mana was restored to its peak. Feeling the magical wave coming from Jirian, another cheer broke out from the crowd outside the Emerald Tower. This was the miracle of a pharmacist. Everyone's heart was filled with the joy of having survived a disaster. If it hadn't been for the bottle of awakening potion, there would probably not be any guild of magic in Gerosis in the future. The ups and downs of life were indeed exhilarating. The mages who were clutching their hearts a moment ago could now await the chance for victory. They had even outlined a scene in their minds, Jirian taking on old Merlin again after recovering his mana. When both sides exhausted their powers once again, the crowd at the Emerald Tower would rush forth and knock old Merlin out completely. Of course, other than President Jirian and Mage Felix, the most glorious position must be left for oneself. Unfortunately, Linley did not give them any chance at all. The mages, immersed in their imagination, soon saw Lin Li's hand reaching into his pocket again. This time, what he took out was yet another sky-blue glass bottle, likewise with the dazzling halo and the pure magical aura. "Let me give you another bottle on account of how excitingly you fought." As soon as the words were out of his mouth, the crowd outside the Emerald Tower collapsed. Particularly old Merlin, who felt a throbbing pain in the heart as he held on to the strong energy crystal. The strong energy crystal was hard to come by. Even with the power and wealth of the Merlin family, only one had been found for so many years. But when it came to the Guild of Magic, just look at what this young mage Felix had done. It was enough to stuff the awakening potion, which was no less precious than the strong energy crystal, into the hands of Jirian. But Jirian had just finished a bottle, and he immediately stuffed him another one based on account of how excitingly you fought. The most precious awakening potion, when it came out of his mouth, was like a carrot that was being stuffed into his hands. Old Merlin wanted to ask if there was any justice left in this world. Everything was over. Feeling the powerful aura coming from Jirian, old Merlin let out a slight sigh and released his grip on the strong energy crystal. All was meaningless. Even if he could absorb as much mana as he could from the strong energy crystal, he would be almost on par with Jirian at his peak. To old Merlin, that meant defeat. What old Merlin had was merely a strong energy crystal, which could only be used once. But what the Guild of Magic had was a potion master who could gift away an awakening potion, and he had just gifted two at once. If the previous awakening potion had brought old Merlin disappointment, then this bottle had no doubt left him in despair. A fully recovered Jirian was enough trouble. Now that he had another awakening potion in his hands, how could old Merlin fight him? Looking at the young mage who was all smiles, old Merlin was filled with regret. All along he had been guessing. Who exactly was that mysterious pharmacist in the Gerosis Guild of Magic? He had once thought it might be Jirian himself, or Kevin, who was near his 30s. He had even thought it might be the mages outside the Emerald Tower, those who were well stricken in years, but average in their performance. But he had never expected it would be a young mage, not even over the age of 20. To be honest, it would be hard to fault old Merlin for it. Everyone knew that years of accumulation were required in pharmaceutics. There were no shortcuts in this field, and even more so there were no so-called geniuses. Regardless of how intelligent one was, it was necessary to accumulate experience through the failures in the long quest to seek a way to reach the top. If he had known that he was the pharmacist, he would have killed him earlier on. He'd not have cared if Jirian had stepped in to help. As long as he killed the pharmacist, the Merlin family would not have any more rivals in Gerosa City. Who would care if he hurt himself along with Jirian in that battle? Surely the Merlin family of today could defeat the Guild of Magic after it lost Jirian. But now, it was too late to say anything. Jirian had completely recovered. With his protection, he had no chance to lay his hands on that pharmacist. For the first time a dejected expression came across old Merlin's face. He knew that he had lost, and he had lost utterly at that. From the beginning where he had sent Cromwell to convey their good intentions, until when he finally relied on the strong energy crystal to challenge Jirian. He had counted every step beforehand, but it just happened that all the steps had gone wrong. Cromwell being swept out of the Emerald Tower by a waterfall strike, Jirian being able to stand again with a bottle of awakening potion. All these were because of the young mage named Felic. Unwittingly, this young man had become the most fearful enemy of the Merlin family, even more so than the most powerful mage of Gerosis, Jirian. In order to let the Merlin family cruise through future crises, they had to first get rid of this terrifying young mage. Old Merlin took a look at Cromwell, who was standing by his side, and then at Linley, who was smiling away. Finally, he clenched his teeth and came to a painful decision. I lost. Old Merlin's voice was dry, but everyone had heard it clearly. Ha 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 ha, Jirian laughed with no manners at all, and even the people on the streets could hear his arrogant voice. Need you say? Go and look in the mirror, you're beaten, all swollen by me. Old Merlin had been mentally prepared before he opened his mouth, but now that he heard what Jirian said, he had the urge to cough up blood. Did this old fatty know what was shame? Old Merlin told himself desperately that he had to bear with it. Did I lose to you? Old Merlin shot Jirian a glare, and shifted his focus on to Linley. The one I have lost to is this young pharmacist. What's the difference? Jirian's laughter was unbelievably pompous. You have restored your mana anyway. If you're indignant, you can still fight me and see who is the most powerful mage in Gerosa City. Old Merlin's face turned purple with rage, and he paid greetings to all 18 generations of Jirian's family in his heart. A rematch? That son of a watermelon. He had the awakening potion in his hands now, only a lunatic would fight him once more. Forget it, Jirian. I'll admit that you are the most powerful mage in Gerosa City. In order to swallow the fury, old Merlin had almost chewed his teeth till they bled. He said with tears for every word, but what's the point? Even if you are the most powerful mage in Gerosa City, does this mean you can shield and connive? Everyone has clearly saw Mr. Pharmacist here humiliating the heir of the Merlin family. If the Guild of Magic is unable to give an explanation for this, I will make sure there's a battle between the two most powerful influences in Gerosa City. It will not do you any good. Though Jirian's tone was tough, his facial expression had changed. After having the potion master, the Guild of Magic already had the opportunity to rise. So long as they auctioned off the 30 bottles of arcane magic potion, the Guild of Magic would be able to grow to a considerable degree in a short time. By that time, the 11 mage families and 6 underground forces would all have to adjust their behavior toward the guild. At this critical point, Jirian would definitely hate to battle it out with the Merlin family. Although Jirian was not afraid of the Merlin family, more so, he had the confidence that he could destroy them with the help in pharmaceutics Linley provided. It was not in line with the Guild of Magic's interests. The conflict between the two most powerful forces would just end up in a Pyrrhic victory, and this would leave room for other powers. It was for this reason that Jirian had not acted rashly. He had gained a definite upper hand, and if he was willing, he could always rely on one bottle of awakening potion to kill old Merlin and his son outside the Emerald Tower. But what for? The Merlin family was not the Guild of Magic, their strength came from wealth and authority. Losing old Merlin and Archmage would not be fatal to them, yet the revenge that had come later on would plunge Gerosa City into chaos. For the dignity of the Merlin's family, I'd sometimes take on thankless tasks. Old Merlin had gained the upper hand for the first time in the conversation. Dignity? That's right. Old Merlin's expression was serious as he pointed his staff towards the crowd where Linley stood. Since this pharmacist had the guts to humiliate the heir of Merlin family, then I guess he'd have the guts to take on the humiliated's challenge. Upon hearing these words, Jirian shot Cromwell a peculiar glance and burst out laughing. This is your so-called dignity? Is it possible you're still half awake, thinking that the little rascal from your family would have the chance to defeat Mage Felix? All I want is a chance for a fair match. Only the two of them, and no one can interfere. After so long, just for this? Jirian's mood lit up immediately. Only then did he understand that the old fellow had threatened him just to let his good-for-nothing son fight it out with Linley. Considering the disparity in strength between the two sides, he had agreed almost readily when he suddenly recalled that Linley was not an ordinary member of the Guild of Magic. He did not express his stance immediately, but instead turned to ask Linley, "What do you think?" "We'll just battle." Linley was somewhat indifferent. Although he wasn't so optimistic like Jirian, he knew very well Cromwell's strength. So long as old Merlin did not interfere, all would be well. No matter what schemes he came up with, it would be hard for Cromwell to pose a threat to him. After the battle today, he'd had a deeper understanding of magic. Absolute power was definitely more important than skills. Even if one did not have an extraordinary gift, he could rely on brutal power to make a clean sweep off everything, like what old Merlin had done to him at the beginning. A month later, I will invite the leaders of all forces in Gerosis. They'll be the witnesses of this duel. Do you think it's fair enough, Jirian? Doesn't matter. Your son is a piece of cake anyway. Humph. Old Merlin could not keep it in at last. With a flick of his sleeves, he left with Cromwell in the midst of Jirian's arrogant laughter. Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.